Welcome to Intersections, the place where we're creating meaningful connections between research and the real world. So today's talk is titled Ni Pardo ni Prieto, and what we're looking at is Hispanic college women's perceptions of skin color and how it influences intimate relationship processes in this population. Now, if you're into pop culture like I am, I spend a lot of time watching various shows on TV, and one of my very guilty pleasures, I admit, are watching the various incarnations of Love and Hip Hop. And of course, I watch Love and Hip Hop Miami with interest given where I live and the politics of Miami and how unique it is. But one of the more popular storylines in the first season was about Amara La Negra, and she is a Afro-Cuban singer who received a lot of flack for her look. Specifically, she went to a producer, and that producer called her out because she was wearing an afro and her skin was dark, and he told her she needs to look more like Beyonce, such that her skin should be lighter and she should present herself with her hair being more westernized rather than its natural Afro Latina state. Another well-known case happened in 2014 in Brazil, and the Global Network, which is the largest television network in Brazil, actually has their annual Carnival Queen, and the person that won by the popular vote was Nayara Justino. But it was interesting, there was a huge backlash, and people were upset because they said she was too dark to be the Carnival Queen, and they actually rescinded the crown and gave it to Erica Amaro, who is pictured here beside Nayara. And Nayara basically lost the crown because people complained that her skin was too dark. And if you Google this story, you'll see the ways in which memes were created in making her look like an ape and putting men's faces on her, and people being very upset that this dark-skinned woman was awarded the title Carnival Queen. What's really interesting, though, is that Brazil has the largest concentration of people of African descent outside of the continent of Africa. So you can think about the implications of this in terms of a Latin American country and our understandings of skin color when there's such a large population there, but there's this huge resentment or backlash against having a important female figure in terms of beauty, sexuality, and power not be allowed to be too dark-skinned. So what I like to do as someone who really loves pop culture is I really look at these narratives that are happening in pop culture and that are discussing in the media. All of these things are really important and are an important way to disseminate information and share it broadly so that it's accessible to a lot of people. But one of the things that we don't do is tie in the empirical research to look at the ways in which there is objective evidence to further support our arguments or give a new lens to looking at the ways in which we evaluate what's going on in our world. And that's what we're going to be doing today. So we tie in what's happening with popular culture narratives and what we know what's going on, but we're also going to show you the ways in which a lot of what we see is part of a larger socio-historical narrative that's grounded within the research and is supported to help us understand behavioral and psychological outcomes that impact people in different ways. So even though we're talking about skin color, in a roundabout way, we're also talking about our understandings of race. Because when someone describes someone racially, one of the most important cues we use to describe them around race is their skin color. But tying back to race, what the research has shown is that there is no biological basis for race. There's nothing that is the same in one race that's not crossing other races or can be found across different groups of people. In fact, what we do know is that these racial categories really change over time, and not because of any biological reason, but usually because of social, political, and economic reasons. And in fact, the research shows that there's more differences within so-called races than there are across races. So again, we use all these phenotypical characteristics to determine or give meaning to a person's race, or help us identify who they think they are, what group they belong to. But what we do know is that there's huge variations across people, and even greater variations within so-called groups of race. In fact, the research shows that only 6% of human genes account for the various phenotypical differences across groups. And when I'm talking about phenotype differences, I'm including things like your texture of your hair, your nose, your eye color, your skin color, etc. So the reality is that skin color is really giving meaning to race, and it's a cue that we use even though it's scientifically inaccurate. One of the more popular arguments in terms of trying to figure out why there are so many variations in phenotypic characteristics, particularly around skin color, is really about location. And if you look at this map of the world, or any map of the world, and you look at where historically people have clustered by skin color, you'll see that really skin color has been really tied to location, such that people who are darker skinned tend to be near the equator, which of course is where it's much hotter, and so having more melanin in your skin, which will make you darker, is actually a protective mechanism. So this type of argument is known as climatic adaptation, and that's again the idea that your body type and your phenotypic characteristics are really tied to the region in which your ancestors are from. And of course, this has changed over time because we no longer live in the same regions and people are a lot more mobile. But historically, long ago, what they found is that things like hair, body shape, height, weight, the shape of your eye, all of these were a result of how bodies were adapting to the climate of the region in which our ancestors lived. So it's really interesting to focus on skin, because skin is usually the first cue we use to give meaning to race and identify people. And that's because our skin is the largest organ on our body. So it's usually the most identifiable cue that we use to give classifications around race in terms of this socially constructed meaning. Now, Bloom and Balch, way back in the 1700s, had actually divided humans into 5 types of races. American was red, and of course American at that time, which is interesting, really was related to First Nations, indigenous Indian populations. Caucasian were whites. Ethiopian was black. Mongolian was yellow, which today we would refer to as Asian in terms of East Asian, and the Malay was brown, which would be more South Asian. Cuvier, who's really interesting, and I have another lecture I do on Black women's bodies, and he is just all over that in terms of race and understanding humans and classifying and having a huge impact on how we see race today. But Cuvier simplified these from 5 categories down to 4, and he just basically said now it's white, yellow, brown, and black. And these kind of are used still today, and we see the influence of these from more than 300 years ago shaping how we discuss race and how we classify people, primarily based on our identifications around skin color. What's really interesting is that skin color is sort of embedded in different ways across multiple cultures. And if you look at the ways in which we give value to them, they've really been tied to colonization in the ways in which we look at it today. It's been shaped by colonization. So in the French colonies, you'll see here it's listed, there's all these different names for people depending on how your parents were identified. So if you were mixed, there were all these categories and different languages around it, and that was also tied to the ways in which you were given value within those societies. And even regionally, these would shift depending on the populations that were there, the people who are in positions of power, and how people want to classify people, particularly around economic, political, and social needs at the time. So here in Peru, again, you're seeing a slightly different lens in terms of how we give meaning to race, which is again tied to the ways in which we understand people by their skin color and their parentage. And we look at these classifications, and While for some people it seems confusing, other people, they just sort of come to understand this. If you've grown up with these categories, you can pull them up rather quickly. And you can look at people, mainly around their phenotype, and figure out which of their classifications they fit into. And that really gives a meaning around ideas about where people are categorized, where they're allowed to go, what privilege they have or don't have. And this is really ingrained in the ways in which we think about people. And it's not just in these other countries, but also informs the ways in which we look at things globally. So I'm really going to focus today's lecture on the United States because I think it's really interesting and so relevant to what's going on today. But the United States really had skin color, vis-a-vis our understandings of race, tied into its actual governmental public policies. Race was really important because race determined economic, social, and political privileges, which were integral to understanding how the United States evolved and who was able to have privileges and who was not, who was then going to economically prosper and who was not going to at all. In fact, if you look at the Naturalization Act of 1790, it actually specifically states that any alien being a free white person who shall have resided within the limits and under the jurisdiction of the United States for the term of 2 years may be admitted to become a citizen. So it was very clear that it was tied to being white in a very explicit way. And this Naturalization Act was in place for a very long time. So that really shaped having this policy. Who's a citizen? Who belongs there? Who has access to owning land? Who has access to having jobs? And having all these privileges which have long-term implications over generations. And I showed you other countries and the ways in which there were classifications based on people. The United States had the same thing. So you had the term mulatto, quadroon, octoroon, half-breed. And these were really, again, tied to your parentage and their presumed race and how that affected you. And some of these terms are still used. They're still very much familiar in some parts of the United States. And again, what was interesting is that how you were classified also indicated whether or not you could have certain jobs, if you can have access to certain levels of education, and more importantly, who you were able to marry. And that type of marriage is important to think about because that was really tied to your ability to have economic and social mobility in the United States. Now, I probably should have brought up earlier, a lot of people say, I don't see skin color. That's actually problematic because skin color is something that we have and it's part of identity. What you might want to say is that you don't give value to skin color. And I think that's where it's okay to celebrate diversity of skin color. But the reality is that skin color is often used in terms of giving privileges or separating people into differential hierarchies. And that's where skin color becomes problematic. So it's not so much that skin color is an issue having the diversity, but it's when we give value to it. And again, the United States, skin color was values were written into the Constitution and really into the ways in which it was structured and ran. So the Census Bureau, for example, began gathering data by race since the Naturalization Act. And basically, you think about this way, a slave only counted for 3/5 of the white person, and Indians themselves were not at all counted. And this then tied to taxation. So you can see skin color was not just simply how you looked at people and what you thought about it, but there were concrete and direct economic implications for this. And what you find originally, too, is that the Irish were first the indentured servitudes here, but blacks were brought over as a form of economic prosperity. So Irish did suffer in terms of being indentured servants, but they were able sometimes to buy their way out as servants, being indentured, while blacks as slaves were tied in. And having this really differential and clear line by skin color helps sort of differentiate and have people look at race and skin color in a unique, different way in terms of giving value. And this continued right through Jim Crow, which was, of course, right up to the 1960s. And you could see that there were policies in place called the one-drop rule. So if you had 1 drop of black blood, which was, again, categorized by the name, you couldn't go to certain places. You couldn't access certain things. Apartheid was occurring right up to the 1990s in South Africa, and in some ways it's still occurring in terms of the justice systems in the United States right up through Jim Crow. And of course there were laws on the book even into the 80s about interracial marriages. So all of these things around skin color cannot be ignored in the United States in terms of how we give value and meaning. Now, in the United States, it's not that this is just simply a white and black issue, but within communities, there are even levels of hierarchies around skin color, such that race and class are so highly correlated that lighter skinned individuals across groups, whether it is in black populations or Hispanic populations, tend to be in higher class and given more social privileges and values. In fact, there's a lot of research now on Hispanics in terms of economic and social mobility, and the research has found that darker skinned Hispanics tend to have lower levels of academic achievement, lower occupational status, and have lower income attainment. Also, if they're darker skinned Hispanics, they're more likely to live in American black neighborhoods than they are to live in Hispanic neighborhoods. So of course it's not surprising that when you look at Hispanic populations, there is a preference for people to identify as white. So we actually have the categorizations, which is, are you Hispanic white or Hispanic other, or are you white non-Hispanic? And people try and figure out what that means, but it's because you find that people really have this meaning and understanding within Hispanic communities about what whiteness and blackness is as it's tied to skin color. So there was a study done more than 20 years ago which found that 58% of Latinos identified as white, 4% as black, 38% as mixed race. But what's interesting, when the interviewers of these people were filling out surveys about these people and were trying to guess on their own what these people's racial identity was, 55% said that these people were dark or very dark and would have identified them as black. So how people perceived themselves and gave meaning to their skin color was very different than the people who were the interviewers. And we often use these regional understandings of who is darker skinned. So for example, Argentinians are viewed as pale, which is Spanish, which is usually given an idea of being higher class. Dominicans are viewed as darker. So you see that these ideas about acculturation and privilege are really tied to our understandings around these skin color meanings. So in the research, we refer to this as colorism. And that's basically a bias, again, that's tied to our phenotype, which is typically our skin color primarily. And it occurs among most groups in the United States. And it also, in this lecture, we're specifically focusing on Hispanic populations. But it's this idea of giving meaning to color within groups and also out groups. But typically what we're going to look at here is within group values around this. So there's a historical understanding that, like most populations, there's a preference for being lighter skinned in Hispanic communities in the United States. And some of that is because of colonization in Latin American countries of origin. But also it's tied to when you come to the United States, because in the United States there's always been this traditionally a black-white dichotomy. So you're either one or the other. And so often this forces people from Latin America, when they come here, to select, well, am I white or am I black? And they call upon their understandings of these terms to figure out which suits them the most. So for a lot of Hispanics or people from Latin America, when they come to the United States, the meanings of race are really different than what it is from their countries, and also what it means around skin color. So this is part of the reasons why you'll see a lot more Hispanics in the United States identify as white Hispanic, even though other people might look at them differently, because the meanings around black and darker skin are very unique or specific within their different countries. So again, these meanings are often tied to outgroup associations. So typically being black, in the idea of when you come to America, it means being African American and all the host of values and meanings they give to that. Also, there's also the familial and community messages about what it means to be black. And if you don't fit into these ideas of being white or black, it means that you are not fitting into your ethnic group's identity. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in terms of what it means around skin color and being Hispanic, according to some of the research we've done. So I'm going to go one step further, that we started broadly about skin color, and then we looked at the United States, and then now this lecture is specific focusing on Hispanics. But I also now want to focus it on women, because what we do know from the research is that skin color is a form of social capital for women of color. So what do we mean by social capital? Well, social capital means that your skin color can really shape how people look at you and the value they give to you in terms of your beauty. And we do know that for women, physical attractiveness is very much one of the most powerful tools that women have in terms of operating in society, because of the pressures we put on women for their appearance. So you find that for women of color, it's one of skin color is a tool that people use to evaluate their physical attractiveness in a way that we don't find it being used for men. Now, in the United States, most of this research tends to focus on black populations, and we do know that lighter-skinned women from the research are traditionally viewed as more attractive and more successful than darker-skinned black women, even when economic status is controlled for. And as a result, this provides more mobility, social mobility for lighter-skinned black women in terms of their ability to find a partner of a higher status. While there is some research that has found in some cases that there's a preference for lighter skinned men, what they do find for men is that when socioeconomic status is controlled for, darker skinned men don't have the same levels of discrimination that darker skinned women do. Instead, it becomes more about their economic mobility that's more important in that way. And again, this goes back to the gendering of the ways in which women are valued in terms of their beauty as their social capital, in a way that men's social capital is not often as closely aligned with physical attractiveness. So how does this play into the experience of Hispanic women? I've using this term Hispanic women for a long time, which really is this broad general term, which I often don't like using, but given the context in which we conduct this research and where I live and the institution with which I work, the term Hispanic is the one that's being used. Specifically in Miami, the term Hispanic is the most popular term being used for that Hispanic people use to describe themselves. Now, increasingly, the younger generation is using Latino, Latina, and Latinx. But historically, Miami has preferred using the more traditional term Hispanic, and this has been found when people are doing marketing research, that you'll see that that's the language that's used. And so Miami, when we're looking at the idea of being a Hispanic urban center, is really unique in terms of understanding what it means to be a Hispanic woman. So it's sort of at the epicenter in the United States. This is sort of the central place where people from Latin America and other countries come to. And Miami itself is truly a Hispanic city in that 70% of the population identifies Hispanic. And moreover, more than half are from and born in another country. So this really sort of shapes the way in which the meaning of being Hispanic is tied here. So in Miami, the mayor is Hispanic. You'll find people in positions of power Hispanic. So you see a really different lens of what it means to be Hispanic in Miami that you wouldn't see in other places. So for example, in Los Angeles, they've only had one Hispanic mayor. There's still a lot of different issues around power. While in Miami, you'll see that there's a range of opportunities for Hispanics because of the way this city has emerged and the ways in which cultures and this community has come together to make their presence known here. Tied to this, which is important to know, is of course Miami is of course a hot tourist place where beaches and sun and everything here is about being sexy and beautiful, and tied to this is the sexy Latina image. And so you find this understating meaning about Hispanic women too being shaped in terms of how people look at skin color and beauty and values around women in Miami in a really unique way that would be different from when you look at Hispanic women, for example, maybe living in New Jersey or New York or living in California or Texas. So when we're talking about the research here, it's really important to keep thinking about the fact that the data and the studies I'm going to show you here were done and conducted in Miami. So I'm going to present the results from a couple of studies we did with Hispanic women in Miami. But I did want to bring up something really quickly, is that I originally was interested in doing a study on Afro-Latinos or Afro-Hispanics, Black Hispanics, when I started doing this. And so my first study I tried to develop was really looking at within group and out group experiences around Black Hispanics and Afro-Latinos. And what was interesting was I had the hardest time recruiting participants in Miami. In fact, after a year and a half of trying to recruit participants, I was only able to get 12, which, given that I had access to the psychology research pool at one of the largest universities in the America, this is really shocking. And that was possibly because, I specifically said, do you identify as Afro-Latino or Black Hispanic, or you're mistaken for this? And people who had dark skin, even people whose skin was darker than mine, and I view my skin as clearly a marker of Blackness, would say, no, nobody's ever accused me of that, and they use the word accused or thought of me like that. Or they were never mistaken. So I want to stress that this is sort of going to give you an insight into some of the findings we're having in the study to understand the implications around what it means around skin color in Miami. So this study was looking at attitudes around skin color and women of color. And so we have some papers out in research on Black women in Miami, and that's a different lecture that we can give you information about. But this one specifically I'm going to present is the data we collected on Black women who were Hispanic. And this data was just collected over a 6-month period. So we actually had 56 Hispanic women who participated in this study. And they were all college students, and most had grown up and lived in the United States and within Miami. Every one of the participants in our study self-identified as racially white but ethnically Hispanic. And so what I'm going to talk about is the findings that we had around their skin color preferences, where they learned about their skin color values, the ways in which their skin color is tied to their understandings of being Hispanic, how they think men look at women skin color, specifically how men look at Hispanic women's skin color, and the ways in which their skin color is really tied to their sexuality and how their sexuality is framed broadly. So what we had here was all the participants basically picked a color from one of these skin color charts that they felt was most closely aligned with their own skin tone. And of course, this is not coming out as clear here, but it's basically like the makeup skin color chart. And for the Hispanic participants, again, they all identified racially as white, and all of them selected from either charts A or B. And if you look carefully, there's some colors in A, B, and C that actually cross over. But for our Hispanic population, they primarily picked from A and B in terms of selecting it. Overall, these women prefer to be labeled as tan, which is really interesting because most studies say the Hispanic women want to be very light, but it does reinforce the prior research that they don't want to see as black. And most of them wanted to have a tanned, and it's because they viewed being tanned as an ideal color within their community and also by other people. So being tanned was really important to these women. So again, this was a qualitative study, so these are some of the comments that the Hispanic women in our study said. And it was funny that there was this real sort of resistance to looking pale or pasty, and those were terms that were used a lot. And what they preferred was being in the middle. And in fact, they liked the idea of being tan because they weren't too dark or they weren't too light. So there was this resistance to looking what we traditionally expected women to look like. And that was really important. And in fact, women who saw themselves as too pale were actually very upset about that and talked about how it was important for them to tan and make sure that they kept their skin a nice, healthy glow in the mid-range color. So again, this sort of challenges the research expectations, but it does show that there are all kinds of different meanings given to skin color depending on context, region, and where you live and what's important. But this tanning thing was really interesting for me when I did the study because research is showing that this in Miami, high school students are more than 2 times more likely to be tanning and tanning more deeply than white students that are living in Miami. And so this shows that this idea of being tanned is not just unique to this group of women, but there's something about that that's occurring that's being shaped across groups of Hispanic women in terms of their understanding of how their skin color should look. While in other parts of the country, you'll see women who are walking around with umbrellas or putting on tons of protective creams so that their skin won't get dark. So in this region, you don't want to be too dark, but it is important to have some coloring if you want to identify as a Hispanic woman in terms of this population. And what they're also finding in the research with dermatology specifically around tanning and Hispanic adolescents and emerging adults. So this goes back to where are these ideas coming from? And there's multiple ways in which it's coming out. So the primary source, though, are families. And what you find is that these girls in our study, or young women in our study, were talking about the ways in which there were covert and overt messages that they received about skin color from their mothers and fathers and other family members. So, and they're very aware of it in terms of what it means. So one of the girls was saying that she's lucky because she's like her father's side of the family and she's got the good color. Another girl was talking about how her aunt had found this bleaching program for her cousin, and they were very clear about doing this because it was important for her cousin to find the right partner, and that's why they did the bleaching, but they weren't willing to pay for school, and this girl was quite shocked by this. But in the interview, she also said, well, I never have to think about it because I'm at the right skin color here. So their ideas about skin color are told to these girls both through direct conversations, but even the ways in which other women are talked about, or even the ways in which dating or marriage or opportunities are discussed and linked to skin color. And this fits with a lot of the prior research that talked about the ways in which we subtly talk about skin color and give meaning to it and the values again. So the idea of making sure that girls themselves stayed light was tied again to their ability to find partners or have children, which had long-term implications for the family and the family's mobility and economic opportunities. So it's not just simply this idea of protecting a Hispanic daughter, but also giving value to the family in terms of being able to be lighter skin tone. And again, this is not just simply being racist. You have to think about what does the research say about who gets privileges, who gets access. So you find another ways in which these girls were given these messages weren't just about themselves, but also who they were allowed to date and the type of men in terms of their skin color, about who's appropriate for them as partners. And as I kind of hinted before too, skin color was also important for being having the sense of being part of your Hispanic community. So women in this study reported that feeling kind of tanned made them feel like they were more Hispanic and they looked more Hispanic. And this also was based upon their feelings about how other people would look at them. So this idea that if they were too dark or too light, they wouldn't be viewed as Hispanic, which was important. So having some color was an important symbol of an authentic Hispanic identity. And like one of the girls said, if you're Hispanic and you're like super like, it's like, what's wrong with you? Why are you not in the sun? Like they expect you to have some darker tones. And so there was this idea too, if you were too dark, then people would assume that you're not Hispanic. So the meaning of being within a group was also tied to these ideas about skin color as well. And I don't think this is unique to Miami per se either, because if you look at the 2010 census, when you're looking at people who identified as Hispanic, overwhelmingly they identified as white racially or some other race, but did not including Black or African American. So basically over 90% said they were anything but Black, despite what we know about the history of various countries in Latin America. So this idea of what it meant to be Hispanic was really importantly tied to the skin colors and even the ways in which we identify within a group today through the census itself too, and how it gives meaning to how we give power, privilege, and we categorize individuals. And going back to the idea of social capital, again, these women sort of reinforce those findings because they've noted that their skin color was really instrumental in their ability to attract a man. And also it shaped what kind of men would be attracted to them. So like one girl said, Hispanic men usually don't go for dark girls. Now and then. They usually don't like white girls either because they don't have any flavor, unless they want to fit into American culture. So the idea of how your skin color really is about your mobility is what she's talking about here. So, and also if you were darker, they said you would attract darker men. And so you hear again that these subtle messages about their skin color identity is really sort of being shaped by what they think males prefer, because this sort of predicts who they're going to be with. And it was one girl said, kind of like what my mom says, everyone with their kind is with their kind. So she's tying in these messages she's hearing from her family to also her understandings about skin color, intimate relationships, and her partners. This is really important to remember because, as we talked about earlier, this skin color as social capital for women is really powerful. And I don't think it's a surprise then why we see bleaching creams are so widespread in countries where you see women with diversity of range of skin, particular darker skin tones, etc., because of this ideal of what skin color and beauty and attractiveness play out for women. In the same way, you also see that women who are very pale don't necessarily want to get darker, and they do all these protections as well too. So these ideas of what men think are important. So when we're talking about skin color, in this case Hispanic women's beauty ideals, and it ties to intimate relationships and their sexual health, it's also important to think about this in terms of how men think about that, because this is really what's shaping and partially driving women's understandings about their skin color and the ways in which they can be viewed as attractive and find life partners. So the final piece that I'm going to present from the results is around the ways in which the skin color really sort of shaped people's ideas of these women's sexuality, and even then in turn their own ideas about their own sexuality. And these women felt that being in the middle, again, was also a safe place to be, because they understood there was a hypersexuality around women of color, which is found across the research. But by being tanned, they were not as hypersexualized as they believed as darker women. So one of them said, for example, she herself saw herself as very light, so she said there weren't stereotypes about her color. But there was this idea that Hispanic women have some flavor, and it's part of this was tied to their skin color and being exoticized around this. And so they recognized that their skin color was sensual and tied to how they were looked at as being beautiful. And so there was this idea of being in the middle made them safe from being hypersexualized, but also not being viewed as asexual or having no sexuality by having a tan identity. So this understanding of skin color is really important because we do know that skin color has historically been a sexual taboo across different cultural contexts. And in some ways it's viewed as having, non-white skin is in some spaces viewed as not valuable, but it is also sexually desirable and exoticized. In some ways we say highly fetishized in different spaces. So when we're looking at Hispanic women's sexuality, the ways they view themselves as beautiful, these messages that they receive and how they give meaning to their skin color is really important, because it sort of shapes the way they view themselves and their self-identity around skin color and its impact on their sexual health and their intimate relationship identities. Now, this is not a definitive study on Hispanic women in Miami and their identity. This was just a study with some Hispanic college students who selected to participate in the study via the psychology research pool. It would be really interesting to do the same study in different parts of the United States. So if we collected this data, in again, New York, Texas, California, I think the results will be very different. Also, if we did it by age. So this, again, were women in emerging adulthood age, which is when a lot of them are thinking about intimate relationships and partners, why it was so important to look at this age group. But it would be very different, for example, women of different generations who are younger or older, who have different meanings and values and understandings of beauties and how it plays out. The other thing that's important, that it's important to think about, that we really didn't address sexual diversity. So we looked at women and their values, and we talked about it in terms of what are men's preferences. So what happens to women who are sexual minorities or identify as lesbian or bisexual or trans women as well? How do these values around skin color match or differ from their own? Another thing is, we're talking about this in terms of dating. So these ideas about skin color, we didn't really look at, does this matter if you're in a committed relationship, if it's someone you just like, you're hooking up? And this is really important, again, when I was talking about generational or where people live, because people are not necessarily looking for one partner in a lifetime, or they're willing to look for different types of relationships. So the values around skin color might differ depending on these types of frameworks. And finally, this data again was collected in Miami. So you have to think about the location and the university where this is tied. This is an urban center where there's going to be a lot more partners available that are of these women's age, of these women's ethnic groups, across the economic ladder. So ideas about dating and partnerships really might shift depending on where other Hispanic women live in terms of their values around skin color. Despite these real limitations, I do think these studies' findings are kind of important and interesting, because it really highlights the importance of skin color and the way it sort of shapes so many aspects of Hispanic women's identities in terms of gender and their ethnic identity, and their ideas around their sexual health and intimate relationship processes. So there's really sort of distinct and identifiable values that are related to skin color that really haven't been explored in the research. So this is something that we have to continue to look at, because it's really different from a lot of the research that's being put out there. And also, we tend to focus on white middle class values around skin color. And so this is really giving a different group's views of their skin color, because these Hispanic women are basically Hispanic women who are working or middle class, but are getting educated, so are highly educated. So all of those things would really provide insights into the ways in which skin color and its meanings are changing over a different generation and with a very different group than what's traditionally studied in the literature. But I in no way am trying to assert that I've presented all the research and all the findings. So I really encourage you to sort of delve into these further readings that I've listed here, because they can give you some more insights into some of the things I've talked about. The citations throughout the lecture are also posted here, but also it might give you some new information, or you might be able to see something that I missed in the research and is not covered here that would be really important to consider as we move along and focus on different aspects of this body of research. So at this point, I'm going to open the floor to questions. I really appreciate you listening, and I really want to hear your ideas and experiences, especially since a lot of people in the audience right now are Hispanic females or are Hispanic identify, and sort of give your insights and feedback on how these research findings sort of fit within your own experiences and the broader narratives in terms of popular culture and what's occurring today. So thanks for tuning into Intersections, the place where the real world and research meet. I encourage you to again look at some of the research that has been cited in this lecture and other relevant resources that are provided. Please check out our other lectures and other presentations that we have, and send us some feedback or ideas for other areas of research that you think we should explore.